Okay. But while Corinne is restarting her computer, I'll go ahead and introduce her. So Corinne is the head of programs at Global Compact Network Australia, which is the local body of the UN Global Compact. She has over 10 years experience as a climate change and sustainability professional, working globally across the corporate, development, and social sectors. Prior to GCNA, Corinne worked for Save the Children Australia on education, health, child protection, and climate change adaptation projects and strategies across Pacific, South, and Southeast Asia, and has had many other global development roles as well as that, including previously at the International Institute for Environment and Development in the UK. So, Corinne, I think we've got you back.
You do. And I don't know why my video isn't starting. I'm so sorry, everyone. It just keeps, I've never had this. It keeps saying, cannot start video, failed to start the video camera, which
Right.
in the entire year of COVID, I have not had that pop up in every single Zoom call that I've had. I'm so sorry. This is so typical.
That's totally fine. And I have known from the start of running an event such as this, Murphy's Law, if something wrong can happen, it will happen. So that's all right. We'll just go ahead and we'll just do the interview without your lovely face. So first, can you just tell us a little bit about what the Sustainable Development Goals are and what they cover?
Yes, of course. So the Sustainable Development Goals, if I sort of backtrack to 2000, so in 2000 we had the Millennium Development Goals, so the MDGs, and they were set up, and there are about 8 goals, I believe, and they were set up with sort of governments and development agencies in mind. And it was really around some of those major issues around poverty, around what was it, gender equality, I think HIV/AIDS, environmental degradation. So there were a couple of different things. I'm just seeing a little note. Maybe I'll just, here's, oh, that's so annoying. I'll figure it out. I will, hopefully at one point I'll be able to get this video working at the same time as I'm talking. And so you had the MDGs, which really covered things around child mortality, et cetera. And so that was a 15-year framework. And that was signed, I think at the time, by about 189 member states. And it didn't really involve businesses at all. And so you fast forward, that was a 15-year time frame. And then in 2015, that was superseded by the SDGs, which some of you may already know about. And that's, so those are the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are 17 goals. There are around 169, I think, targets, and then over 250 indicators that support that whole framework. And the SDGs are far more comprehensive. They're a lot broader. They're a lot deeper than what the MDGs were. And I guess the sort of key change or key difference here with the MDGs is that the business voice very much came through in some of those conversations and consultations that led to the development and of the SDGs. And there you go. And so across those SDGs, as you can see, they cover things like no hunger or zero hunger, no poverty, climate action. And so some of those key differences, so the MDGs would have talked about things like education, hunger, poverty, but they didn't really look at things like affordable and clean energy, climate action, industry innovation, responsible consumption and production, peace, justice, and strong institutions, or partnerships. And so for those of you that were on the call this morning, Pete from Thank You was talking about the need for partnerships, which is such a fundamental piece in the equation when you're trying to reach these 17 goals. Now, at first, when you're looking at the goals, and I know for a lot of businesses, whether you're a large corporate or a one-person business, the 17 goals can be quite daunting. So you're looking at them thinking, what on earth do I do with these? There are so many. And so I think the intent with these is not to try and do everything, and we can go over this as we sort of continue talking, but it's really about, as a business, trying to figure out which ones make the most sense for your business and articulating a plan that supports how you're going to achieve those particular goals. And so it might be that for your business, that you only have sort of 3 that you want to affect any kind of change towards whether that and sort of affect, and by that I mean sort of positive impacts. But when you're looking at those goals, it's also about looking at your business and thinking, how is my business impacting on some of these goals, on the attainment of some of these goals? And so it's really trying to take a more holistic view and understanding of what your interactions with these goals, with your business plan, with your strategy, and with your end product. And so that's sort of by and large what the SDGs are. They're essentially a blueprint for governments, businesses, communities to understand what they can do within their own operating sphere to achieve one or more of these goals by 2030, because these are also time bound like the MDGs were. That's them in a nutshell, really.
And yeah, sorry, I figured I'd put them up on the screen since we can't be looking at you, so we have something to look
Great
at.
idea.
And what I really love about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they were basically a global materiality process.
Yeah.
That so our previous speaker, Gordon, touched a little bit on materiality, and that's not necessarily a lot of a word that a lot of small businesses really know, because it is all about materiality is understanding what's most important to your business in terms of where you have the biggest impacts, but also what your stakeholders care the most about. And we'll touch more on that in later sessions as well. But each company that goes through that, you know, they talk to all of their internal management staff and their external stakeholders, and coming up with these 17 goals was basically that at a global level. So it took a very long time. And there was obviously, you know, all different levels of government and international organizations coming together to agree on these. And that's a massive undertaking.
Yes, it was. And, you know, when you have 193 member states agreeing to one international framework through which all governments will be held to account on, that was an incredibly arduous process. And the fact that they then were willing to bring in the business voice, which was so critical, because we know that to achieve those goals, you can't do it without the weight of business behind you. NGOs and governments know that they can't do that alone. And so, and when you're thinking about business, it isn't just your large listed corporates, it's also your SMEs and your micros. And by micro, that's how we define them at the UN Global Compact. It's really those companies that have 10 or less employees. But we've seen a huge increase of the amount of micro SME companies coming to the fore and actually embedding and integrating the SDGs. That's probably some of the questions that I get at the moment almost daily are from that base as opposed to the larger corporates. So I think it's such a critical cohort to achieving the SDGs.
Yeah, awesome. And that's it, just picking, as you said, focusing on the one or two or three that are most relevant to your business, I think is particularly good advice for a small business, whereas a large corporate kind of will say, like, you look at a corporate sustainability report and they seem to think that they're actually contributing to all 17, but we all know that they're not contributing significantly to each of them.
Yeah, and it was, and I think companies that understand it and that get sustainability know that they can't impact on all 17. And some of sort of the leading lights in that space, whether you think about Transurban or Australia Post or Brambles, for instance, will try and pick out a few key ones. I know you have Susan Mizrahi speaking later, and she's great. She's at Australia Post, and the work that they've done in the SDG space is impressive in terms of how they've tried to embed the SDGs across everything that they do.
Great. We'll make sure to ask her a little bit more about that. Yeah. No, I'm just making sure to write that down. So can you tell us about how the goals work in practice? How are they actually being implemented by government and business?
So I guess there's a few ways. Government, it's interesting. It depends which governments you're talking about. And not all governments are implementing them at the same pace or in the same way. Same with businesses. And I guess there's a few key things if you're interested in knowing a bit more about this space. There's this report that came out by Transforming, so the report's called Transforming Australia. It's run out of Monash University. It's the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, so SDSN, and they've produced this report, and it was I say post-COVID, not really, well, still kind of in it, but it was sort of looking at how we're tracking against each of the goals and how COVID might have impacted that. And the reason that I bring that up at the moment is because that sort of gives us an indication of what people or businesses are actually doing in that space. And what you'll see on that report is that we're not doing that well. So overarchingly, we're not tracking well against the 17 goals. And this has been a fundamental bugbear or issue that we're coming across globally. In Australia, the SDGs very much sit within DFAT, which is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And you kind of see the goals in other departments, but probably not as much as you would like. And so I think from a government perspective, the federal level, not that I want to sort of say too many things out of line here, but I'm not seeing the level of energy and effort and investments that are required to get us to 2030. That changes when you start going to state levels, and it changes again when you start going to the business level. So within businesses, despite the fact that we're not tracking well across some of those goals, so if I think about climate action, we're not doing well in Australia. And that makes sense given that our targets are still relatively inadequate to reaching net zero by 2050, even though Scott Morrison has just indicated that that's something that he's now willing to discuss publicly. And so from a business perspective, what we're seeing is that there has been a gradual uptake of the SDGs. We're seeing it across that top 150 listed companies, but we're also seeing it within the SMEs and the micros. And so in terms of your tangibles, what does that look like in practice? That can be a whole range of different things. So if I take I'll take an example of a large corporate and then a small company so that you sort of get a sense of what's happening. If you think about Officeworks, large business, well-known, they have done a huge amount of work, and they actually won an award a couple years ago with the Banksia Foundation, who host these yearly sustainability awards events. And so what they've done, along with Bank Australia, for instance, is that they have really looked at the regenerative environmental piece. So for Officeworks, for instance, it's plant 2 trees for every tree that's used in their materials, because obviously they're very paper-based in sort of outputs in their products. Bank Australia hold the largest reserve. I think it's about 920 hectares or so. And that's all around increasing Indigenous knowledge, regeneration of a particular space. So again, you're looking at goals like life on land, you're looking at responsible consumption and production. So there are a range of large scale activities that some of those larger corporates are doing. If you then look at the other end of the scale, and I'm sort of focusing more on environment, we can look at other areas afterwards. You have companies like Sprout Coffee that we would consider to be still a micro, still just a few employees. Steve Joy is their founder. They're members of the UN Global Compact and members of the Global Compact Network Australia, where I work, who I work for here. And everything that they do embeds the SDGs across their work. And so the way in which they went about doing that is they use this tool called the SDG Action Manager. I don't know if you've heard of it, but that was in collaboration with B Corp and with the UN Global Compact. And that really enables you as your business to go through your strategy, your priorities, and figure out where are the areas that you are most likely to impact on across those SDGs. And that will enable you to think about your supply chain, your value chain, your products, your strategy, where you're going, and how you're going to build a more resilient business. And through that process, you start to think about all of the different investments and innovations and technologies that you might need to create a business that is more resilient and sustainable to the types of shocks that we're seeing today. And that's really critical, because for a business today, you need to understand when you're looking at these SDGs, and I'm sort of going about it in a roundabout way to answer your question, but this is really critical because as a business, you not only want to create whatever it is that your idea, your baby for your business, but fundamentally, it's about understanding what are the environmental, societal shocks that are likely to come through over the next decade, and how will your business navigate that And how will this blueprint enable you to navigate that better? And we saw that with COVID. Some businesses thrived, others didn't. Now, there are a whole array of reasons for why some businesses did not thrive through that process or struggled. And, it's probably isn't the time or place to go through every single reason, but the businesses that did use a lot of those sustainability resilience principles, a lot of those have come through. Not all of them. And I'm not saying this is a silver bullet. I'm not saying that this will magically enable your business to get through every single shock that we are likely to see. But it's a pretty good basis through which to support your business. And those are the activities that we're seeing. It's businesses who understand not just their environment, but the environment within which they're operating, and understand the supply chains and the businesses that they're working with and where they're operating, because they need to understand what will impact on them, because that will obviously flow onto them at one point. And so it's really deeply understanding the risks and the opportunities, because I've talked a lot about risk, but opportunities is fundamental to seeing, well, hang on a second. If we are looking at this blueprint and we want to achieve reduced inequalities, climate action, responsible consumption and production, what are the opportunities that will exist for my business if we're all tracking in that direction by 2030? Because we're not tracking in the other direction. Fundamentally, we can be as critical as we like that people aren't doing enough or that we're potentially a bit slow. But the step change is such that we are transforming our economies and our businesses to track in this direction. So I guess it's, what do we need to do as a business to ensure that we are not the laggard as we're moving in that space?
Yeah, amazing. I think that it's a really interesting point that this is that the SDGs are almost a resilience tool.
Yeah.
That they're a framework that businesses can use to consider what are the risks and opportunities, what their impacts are on the world, and what potential impacts the world will have on them in terms of that change in society.
Yeah,
Fascinating.
absolutely.
Now, why do businesses tend to get, like, aside from that that benefit, which I think is probably a benefit that people were not expecting when they decided to join into the SDGs and to commit to them and to align with them. What has driven businesses especially to get involved in the SDGs up until now?
I guess there's a couple of reasons. In some cases, it'll be policy shifts. So the SDGs that kind of enable you to get ahead of the curve. So, when you think about the Modern Slavery Act, if you're already operating in the SDGs space, you're already starting to think about those types of things. So you're enabling your business to get ahead of policies, which often can take time to sort of catch up, depending on the country that you're talking about, whether you're talking about Australia or now the US. Huge policy shifts are coming through as a result of Biden being elected. So climate change was not a key priority in the US. It now will absolutely be a key priority, especially with John Kerry now leading the charge and sort of as we lead into the next conference of parties. So with the SDGs, they enable you as a business to think about, regardless of what's happening at the government level, they enable you to get ahead of those policies when they come through, because they will come through eventually. And so, for instance, if I take the example of France, they announced recently that they wanted all EVs, so all electric vehicles on the roads, I think by 2030 or pretty close, which essentially sends a pretty strong signal to companies like Peugeot or Renault or any one of the major car manufacturers that we need to get to 100% production on electric vehicles in the next decade. Mm-hmm. So when, as a business, you are thinking about those things, you can already be ahead of the curve if you think, hang on a second. As a country, when you look at other countries that are starting to think about electric vehicles, it's only a matter of time, given how interconnected we are globally, that Australia will at one point announce that we will need to have very strong targets around electric vehicles. And so when you're thinking about the SDGs and you're thinking about those goals and what we're actually trying to achieve, which is essentially leaving no one behind and having a world that is more equitable and sits within our planetary boundaries, what is likely to come down the track? And so businesses that are somewhat savvy and thinking about their bottom line, because there are clear profits to be had too. This isn't just for the ethically minded individual. This is clearly a business opportunity. Otherwise, businesses, however much I love business, wouldn't all do it. There has to be a clear profitability in aspect in this. And so the opportunities that exist within that investment piece are also really high. So there's that. Then there's the fact that as employees and as consumers, and I think Pete touched upon this, I think the presentation previously maybe touched upon this, consumers are asking for this. So consumers, employees are asking of their employers and of businesses to do more and to do better. And we're starting to see that represented in the shelves. Like you walk around Kohl's or Woolies, 8 years ago, there was not the breadth and depth of products that you see now that take sustainability and environmental sustainability and of course ethical sustainability to the heart and core of what they do. There are far more companies like Thank You now out there than there were a decade ago. And there's a reason for that, because more and more people are wanting that. You know, questions around, is your packaging recyclable? Unilever has been working on that for years. It's not a straightforward thing. I thought it would be really easy to just have recycled bottles in your shampoo. It's not that simple. It actually takes a lot of testing. So all of those things are changing because the new cohort of people coming out of university are far more in tune with those types of questions. And that sort of war for talent is a real thing. And so individuals, companies that get the war of talent want the best. And to have the best, you need to have those sustainability principles infused in everything that you do, whether it be your strategies, your priorities, and the products that you're putting out on the shelf, if that's your type of business. So there's that. And then there's the investor piece. Investors are asking really hard questions. You know, when you have BlackRock, which is one of the major investor groups globally, asking some of the most pointed questions to some of these listed companies around what they're doing on climate change or modern slavery, companies listen, their boards listen, their C-suite listens. So you're starting to see big shifts. And then of course you have trends. So whether you look at what's happening in Europe or in the US or Asia, there are huge shifts to, for instance, being net zero or setting a science-based target. And by setting a science-based target, I mean setting a target that ensures your company can operate within that 1.5 to 2 degree world or space. So when you have those types of initiatives, or you have RE100, for instance, those are all really important initiatives that are driving momentum. And we're seeing that across a range of different areas. So I guess those are some of the big drivers that we're seeing. It's your employees, it's your consumers, it's your investors, it's policy shifts, and it's also these major trends that we're seeing. And it's these investment flows that are starting to enable those changes to take place.
It's interesting that things like going carbon neutral are almost becoming standard practice. Like they are becoming so mainstream just in the last year. So many companies have come out with those announcements, even the ones that you would never expect to be there, including, you know, large accounting firms and things like that. So it's become, yeah, almost a ticket to play, I think you could say. So that's particularly interesting. I do note that one of the questions that's already come through from Tara is about RE100, which you just mentioned. So I might just touch on that about, she's asking about the relationship between the SDGs and those other corporate and NGO-driven initiatives like the RE100. Is that working, I guess, in terms of actually improving the situation and increasing accountability?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. How do I answer this in maybe a couple of different parts? So yes, those initiatives in one sense are working because we're seeing an uptake in the amount of companies that are joining these types of initiatives. So they're not just niche initiatives. They are, I mean, if you talk about RE100, it's really around looking at 100% renewable electricity, for those that don't know the initiative, and they have a lot of information online. And those initiatives are no longer corner sort of based initiatives. They're no longer being pushed by the sustainability expert in a company. They're things that companies are having to do because of the range of initiatives that exist. So if I think about renewable electricity, and I think about that within the context of the Science-Based Target Initiative as one example, the number of companies that have set targets has increased exponentially, which means that companies like Yarra Valley Water, Telstra, Brambles, Australia Post, who else? Bank Australia. There are about 25 or 26 companies in Australia that have set or committed to set a target in that space. When a company does that, it has a huge knock-on effect to their supply chain and to all of the other initiatives that they're taking part of, because it means that that company is going to change the way that it operates to ensure that it can meet a 1.5 or 2 degree world, which means that initiatives like RE100 make absolute sense because they're probably going to have to start making big shifts in around renewable electricity, for instance, to be able to meet their scope 1, 2, and 3 requirements to hit a 1.5 or 2 degree space. So yes, those initiatives are working because they sit within a much broader macro space. They're not in isolation. They work together, if that makes sense. So it's not that, does this initiative work by itself? Maybe, but it actually, these initiatives work because there are a number of different initiatives that all support one another in one way, shape, or form. So the SBTI works because it has RE100, and it works because you have the investor group on climate change also making demands and sort of asking companies to do more in the investor space. And so the initiatives that we're starting to see, well, not starting to emerge because a couple of them have been around for a couple of years, but what we're starting to see is a step change in the fact that all of these initiatives work together as puzzle pieces. And that's why they're working, because we're seeing the transformations as the initiatives work to build on one another to support businesses to reach one or more of these goals, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's sort of, and when you think about the UN Global Compact, which in a sense is an initiative, it's a membership-based organization. We now have over 15,000 members that are working towards not just the SDGs, but things around human rights, labor rights, anti-bribery and corruption, the environment. So when you have major initiatives like that, working with PRI, which is Principles for Responsible Investment, working with RE100, working with the IGCC, so the Investor Group on Climate Change, and working with a whole host of other initiatives, yes, we're starting to see change.
I like how you referred to puzzle pieces, because I mean, even the goals in front of us look a little bit like, puzzle pieces, but there's many puzzle pieces within each one that individual initiatives work together to achieve the overall outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned the market opportunity, and I've read that there's a $12 trillion market opportunity
Yes.
in developing the SDGs. That's a pretty amazing headline that's been bumping around for a couple of years now.
It has.
But what does that actually mean? Like, what is that money there for?
You know what, it's funny. I was thinking about this number last night because I'm like, hang on, where did this number come from again? Because it's used in so many different headlines and reports, and it's this great sort of in big lights, like $12 trillion, look at everything you can do. So yes, that number came out of this report called Better Business, Better World. I think the report came out in 2017. If you have time, have a quick look. This isn't just magical money that exists at the moment. This money, I don't want people to get too excited. It's not it doesn't exist. It's not necessarily there at the moment. But the reason that they came up with that number, so there's a couple of things. One, it's across 4 different areas. So I think it was across energy, cities, food and agriculture, and there was one more, health and well-being. Yep.
And materials was also in there as well with energy. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so within those different areas, it's around the investments that need to take place from both the public and the private sector, investments that will enable us to reach the SDGs. So as an example, and I apologize if I keep using more of the environmental slant, my background's in climate change, so that's sort of an area that I work on very heavily. But if you think about a transition, so at the moment you may have heard of the term just transition. Just transition is around how we transition our economy, entire economies globally, to net zero by 2050. When you start to think about what that means, so you start to think about coal mining and how that particular business will no longer exist in a net zero world in the way that we're seeing it today. If you think about all of the businesses that are dependent on that particular business, what happens to those businesses and what are the investments required to transition all of those businesses? And it's that investment piece the 12 trillion is referring to, I believe. I wasn't one of the authors of that report, but essentially it's the investments that investors, governments are making that will enable us to get to one or more of those goals. So if you think about gender equality, what are the investments that businesses need to make to ensure that there is better gender equality across the board in their business, across their boards, across the C-suite? How do you reduce inequalities across your business? What investments need to be made to do that? And then larger scale, that's more inward looking, outward looking. How do you build more sustainable cities? What is the infrastructure required to meet a net zero world? So the level of investments you're looking at there might be in the millions, it might be in the billions, depending on the city that you're talking about. It's those investments that we're talking about when you're thinking about capitalizing on the flows that will come through. So it is my understanding. And then in addition to that, that will create, I think the report said close to 400 million jobs per year. Now, again, I'm not behind the numbers. I couldn't tell you exactly the metrics that were used to come up with these numbers. I'm also really bad at math, so please don't ask me. But those are the numbers that we're seeing at the moment. And given that we're not on track to meeting the SDGs by 2030, that means that the investments aren't yet all there. Some of them are, absolutely. And we'll start seeing a lot of that investment coming through, for instance, in the US, when I think about Biden and some of the big announcements that he's made. And when you think about announcements that are being made at the state levels here or within businesses, if a business announces it's going to be regenerative by 2030, then the investments that will flow on to support that will be such that we'll start seeing that flow coming through. But we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, I think that's really well explained. And by the way, for anyone who is planning or who's going to be attending a few of the other sessions, we will be hearing from Sustainability Victoria as one example tomorrow, and also an accounting firm, Blue Rock, not to be confused with Black Rock, both talking about that flow of money in Australia and all of the grants and incentives that are available from those kinds of policies that are committing to the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think that, yeah, you've captured that really well in terms of, in order to achieve these goals, there's a lot of services and products that will be needed, but also new approaches, new technologies, new innovations that we don't yet have. So there's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think just as a side thing, I know that in the previous conversation, he talked about a circular economy. And that's an area for massive investment. So if you think about the Australian Packaging Covenant, for instance, they sort of bring together a lot of those members to talk specifically about our consumption and the production of goods and the responsibility that a business now has on that good that they're putting out to market. So IKEA, for instance, the responsibility that it has when it produces a material good. It is now up to them to be responsible for what happens at the end of that life of that product. It's no longer just the consumer that is responsible for that. It's no longer linear. So you no longer just buy a product and throw it away. It's circular, and that at one point it has to go back into the system, which is why Ellen MacArthur Foundation is such a great organization, because they really are the sort of pioneers in that circular economy space. But again, the investments that are required to support a circular economy are such that we'll start to see that flow there. And when you're talking about circular economy, it's also important to note that you have to have the policy levers there as well. You can't just do it by yourself. It's too difficult. You need to have a number of different stakeholders at the table.
Absolutely. Okay, there's a few questions from the audience that I'd like to get through.
Sure.
So one of them from Robin is, if big organizations are driven by investor actions, how can we, from individuals to small businesses and communities, encourage investors to push them even further?
Oh my gosh, thanks, Robin. Such a hard question. So I think it's a really tough question because so I have this conversation with a lot of the smaller companies here. And I guess this is just one example because of the interconnected nature of how we work today. The smaller companies, in a lot of cases, work with the larger corporates. And I think it's around not just having that top down of policy changes, the corporate pushes down its desires on the smaller company. It's about the smaller companies coming together and pushing up what they're wanting. So, and I know that probably sounds quite challenging and it's not meant to be easy. None of this is. And so I don't want you to think, oh, Corinne has no idea. She's completely divorced from reality. I do understand that there are clear challenges in pushing up the changes that need to happen. But we're starting to see that more and more. So collectively, the voices of the smaller companies that I've been speaking to are coming together and having those conversations with some of the larger SMEs and some of the corporates and saying, this isn't actually good enough. We need to do more. And I think it's by showing how you are operating as a business, that becomes the gold standard. And that sort of starts to flow through. And we're starting to see those conversations, not even starting, those conversations have been ongoing in a lot of those large corporates about how do we do better and not just push down on what we think we need from the smaller company. It's starting to become much more of a two-way conversation. And I think not to sort of applaud the UN Global Compact, but I think when I think about B Corp and UN Global Compact and the way in which they have worked with those smaller companies to make that more of a standardized way of operating, has helped with that as well. And the certification systems that smaller companies are going through, of which a lot of them are, is also pushing step changes through some of those conversations because they also have requirements.
Absolutely. Now, there's a couple of questions that are specific to who are the operators in this space. So one, how do companies like Officeworks find and decide on the mechanism for offsetting their environmental impact? Especially, is there an established local marketplace in Australia for things like land regeneration? Carbon offsets obviously have a certificates market. Are there other ways that businesses can access offsets?
Mm-hmm.
I'm also going to ask in the same breath a question about circular economy and who is leading in that space in Australia.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So I can't answer every single one of those points. I would have to get back to you. In terms of the circular economy, there are a number of companies. I'm only going to list Brambles because I've watched. So for those of you that don't know Brambles, if you know the Shep pallets, so those wooden pallets that are shipped globally, so that's them. The work that they have done and the announcement they just made around being completely regenerative by 2030 is impressive. And so the work that they are doing collectively to ensure that they have, and I don't want to speak on their behalf because Lachlan, who heads up their sustainability, Lachlan Figans, can speak to this far better than I ever could. But the work that they are doing at the moment to hit those targets, they recently set a target, their science-based target. Everything that they are doing, every single initiative they're signing up to is to support the announcement that they will be regenerative by 2030. We're seeing similar things with things like IKEA. They are doing, there's been a lot of criticism over the years about some of the work they've done, but when you look at what they're doing in this space, in the circular economy space, it's actually quite impressive. The fact that their CEO also needs to, his title is also Chief Sustainability Officer, there's a reason for that. It's not just semantics. It's because from the very top through to its employees, the sustainability circular economy modeling is so strong across every layer of that company. Are they perfect? No. And there's no perfect company. There is no best practice at the moment. There is good practice, and we're seeing more and more good practice across companies, which is good because there are a lot of laggards and a lot of companies that aren't doing well. So when you have larger companies make these announcements, we do see step changes across those other corporates and SMEs. In terms of the carbon offset, I'm going to have to get back to you. I don't want to talk on behalf of Officeworks because I don't know every single detail and I don't want to sort of make a mistake. But I can absolutely put you in contact with someone there who's sort of been leading on that work, so that you can have that information to hand. But I just wouldn't feel comfortable talking about sort of some of what they've done in that offsetting space.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just writing down that it was Marcus, if we want to be able to get that back to him. And perhaps we'll be able to post in the Facebook group later on any follow-ups as well. So yeah, that's just a reminder for anyone. The Facebook group, you should have received a link to it. You can also access it via the Small Mighty CSR Facebook page. There will be a link to join the group called Small Mighty Heroes. So that's where you can connect with everyone else who's joining this event and be part of that conversation, access all of the resources that Corinne has just mentioned. I've just jotted those down and I'll be posting them in the Facebook group. Just quickly before we finish up, Corinne, I'm asking everyone for their number one piece of advice for small businesses. So for you, what's your number one piece of advice for those looking to be more sustainable or purpose-led in 2021?
I guess it's not treating it as an ad hoc piece. It's about trying to understand fundamentally how resilient you want your business to be. And if you want your business to be resilient and sustainable and really give back to the communities within which you operate and have communities that still exist in the next few decades, and have communities that aren't torn apart by inequalities and injustice, and that you are supporting decent work. It's about understanding how you want your business to fit into that model so that you are a part of that change as opposed to being a barrier to the changes that are coming. I guess in one sense. It's hard. There's a lot of different things. And I'm sorry, my video, I've been trying to play around with different settings and it just hasn't worked. I have no idea what's going on. So I'm so sorry for that.
That's all right. We know that these things are going to happen. So yeah, all good. Thank you so much, Corinne, and thank you everyone else for joining. If you want to get in touch with Corinne, you can certainly go to the globalcompact.com.au, I believe it is.
Yeah, and I'll just type in my email address just in case you have any other questions that I wasn't able to get to. So just feel free to email me or catch me on LinkedIn. Either way works well.
Perfect. All right, brilliant. Thank you very much. And we've got a lunch break until 1 o'clock. So I will see you all again then.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone. Bye.